Be me, 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 yeah, be me, be me, yeah, be me, be me, yeah, be me, be me, don't me, should have been me, could have been me, would have been me, or try to do my own thing, be myself, love myself, choose myself, everything that I want to do when I'm right here beside you, feel like I can't let go without you, feel like I'm always stuck with you. Feel like I'm already changing my ways, changing the game. Feel like I'm already changing the page. Feel like that I'm stuck in the same place. Feel like I need to be where I am, where I want to go, where I want to be, meant to be. Let it be. Feel like I'm already let it go. Move on, holding on. Feel like I can't let you down again. Yeah. Be me, 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 yeah, be me, yeah, be me, be me, be me, be me, be me, be me. Be me, yeah, be me, yeah, be me, be me, be me, be me, be me, be me, yeah, be me, be me, be me, yeah, be me, be me, be me, be me, be me, be me. Everything that I went through since I was 13 years old when I tried to control my anger, losing control, losing everything, controlling everything, admire everything, adore anything, assuming everything, accusing everything because everything changed, everything that I already changed. My life changed, my ways. Feel like I'm already stuck in the same place. Feel like I'm already stuck on the same day. Feel like I was a kid. Feel like I need to chase that dream to be me. Yeah. Be me, be me. Gave me a reason to be where I am. Feel like accepting me for who I am. Feel like I'm already changing my ways. Feel like I'm stuck in the same day. Feel like I was stuck in the same place with you. Yeah. Be me, 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 be me. Be me, be me, be me, ooh, 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 be me, be me, be me, be me, ooh, be me, be me, be me, ooh, be me, be me, be me.